Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on Discourses of Security. Today, we're going to follow up what we did last week. Last week, we looked at security as a speech act. Today, we're going to look at security as practice. And you will soon see that these two discourses are closely related to each other, although there's been a lot of debate also between them and between protagonists that have articulated their views of security within each of these discourses. So let's start with a recap, and you will see how this will lead us directly into the idea of discourse as of security as practice. So last week we looked at security as speech act, an idea that we linked mostly to the Copenhagen School. Security in this particular rendition is seen as discursively constructed through a process of securitization. This process of securitization is in effect a collection of speech acts, each of which is a securitizing move, and if those are successful in the sense that they capture a lot of society, most of the society, in the sense that they capture the majority of people and are widely accepted, then we can speak of a successful securitization. A securitizing move represents an existential threat to a referent object, represents something as an existential threat to a referent object, and this legitimizes extraordinary policy measures. And we've discussed to some extent that these individual elements of this definition are all slightly problematic. So what exactly counts as existential? Who can be a referent object? What is extraordinary? All of these things are contested. However, we've also noted how in relation to COVID-19, for instance, we see a pretty clear securitization process. No one doubts that this was represented as an existential threat. No one doubts that there are extraordinary measures that have been legitimized through the securitization process. So this provides a formal, a discursive definition of security rather than a substantive definition. It does not give an answer to what security actually is in terms of a specific threat or a specific policy field. It provides a particular idea about how something has to be phrased if it is to be a security issue. I link this to post-structuralist work about othering, about the representation of issues as threats, which we also find in that work. And from this particular argument, I made the argument that therefore I read the idea of security as a speech act as a critical exercise, as an exercise in which we question the moment when something is represented as this existential threat. This does not mean that, of course, there are existential threats and that therefore security talk may at some point be warranted and needed. And indeed, we pointed to the normative ambiguities in the sense that you need to securitize sometimes in order to bring something onto the political agenda. And on the other hand, securitizing something, of course, is always a powerful exercise in representation. It always excludes certain things. It always represents reality in particular ways. This ambiguity is inescapable. You cannot solve this issue. But it was important, I think, that we noted it and that we saw that it is not always like the Copenhagen School initially had it, a negative thing. So the closure, the limiting of public debate may at some point actually be needed. And indeed, therefore, the normative assessment of securitization may need to refer to normative deliberations outside the framework itself and cannot take the closure or the marginalization of particular positions alone as the criterion. This may have to be balanced against other normative concerns. Think about climate change. But all of these questions are normative questions, are questions that lead us to critical analysis of those processes. And therefore, I see securitization as such a critical exercise, as a critical exercise that makes us aware of exclusionary practices, that makes us aware of measures that may have been unwarranted, makes us aware of representations of reality where there have indeed been alternatives, and not necessarily the idea that the existential threat is the only possible representation. I've ended last week with pointing to the many contestations of securitization theory, and I didn't even get into the most recent one about charges that it is racist, and you found a lot of this on Elias to follow up. But in particular, we did talk about the political implications of securitization, including the question of, if you do analyze securitization, whether you become part of these securitization processes. And we did discuss the conceptual precision that sometimes perhaps is not as precise as one would hope it would be, and this often becomes clear when we go to empirical analysis and look at these. Now, in contrast to security as a speech act that was associated with the Copenhagen school, we often find in textbooks reference to another school, the so-called Paris School of Security Studies. Now, these people also talk about securitization, but they have a very different view of securitization. So we're going to have to ask how their understanding of a security discourse is different from the Copenhagen School, and to what extent, and this is what it will amount to in part, to what extent is securitization a practice rather than a discourse? Things like issues of fear and risk become concepts that are now in this discourse important ingredients. The governmentality of unease is I think, very nice term coined by Didier Bigot, one of the representatives of this school, that makes us aware of particular features of securitization that are not captured by the Copenhagen School. And also not captured is the role that bureaucracies and technology play. And again, these are two aspects that are put into the foreground by people who talk about security as practice. So when we go back to last week and we look again at the debates about the Copenhagen School, we see that at least 4 of these are immediately relevant to our discussion today. Is security really only a speech act? Well, obviously, by giving this lecture the title Security as Practice, there is obviously a dispute over the practices that result in securitization, and obviously there seems to be an argument that this cannot only be a speech act, there must be other things that lead to securitization. What counts as an extraordinary measure? We saw last week that at the end of the day, one of the differences between critical security studies and security as emancipation on the one hand and security as speech act is that the Copenhagen School does no longer focus on the everyday, but reinstates, if you will, the security as the extraordinary, focuses on the extraordinary threat that is also then countered by and legitimizes extraordinary measures. Whereas what we will see today is a return, if you will, back to the idea of the everyday and the ways in which securitization actually happens as we go along in our lives, on every corner, if you will, that there are securitization processes, routines of securitization. This raises issues about the border between politics and security, which we already asked. If security is the everyday, then clearly the border can no longer be so clearly delineated between politics and security. And then there's also the question of who then can speak, or perhaps it is better to say enact security. The focus of the people who look at security as a speech act is largely on decision makers, so politicians, if you will, in many systems. But if security is a practice that works perhaps through technologies, there are perhaps other actors and perhaps other material forces, if you will, that can enact security. And so we come to a much larger understanding of the relevant network that can provide and construct security. And so if we now look at this discourse of security as a practice, we see a number of differences towards the idea of security as a speech act. The first one is one that we've already noted, and where my interpretation of the Copenhagen School would actually move away from the idea of security as a speech act already. I emphasized last week that I would see securitization rather as a discourse than individual practices. And I also noted how there is a certain tension within the Copenhagen School's arguments about, on the one hand, focusing on the moment of the speech act, i.e. the securitizing move, and on the other hand, talking about securitization as the successful securitizing move, but that presupposes that the securitizing move doesn't stand on its own, but is shared within a particular society or community. And in a similar way, if you look at security as practice, the idea is that it's not an individual moment of a speech act, a decisionist moment in Schmittian terms that decides whether something is security or not, that decides whether someone is friend or foe. It is rather a continuous flow of practices. And this brings us to this idea of security being constructed in everyday life. So it's not, there's a deeper understanding of politics that informs this particular understanding of security, that focuses not on the individual decision and therefore not on the power of a particular speaker to decide in a particular speech act what is security and what not. But politics, and therefore then also security, unfolds in a much more complex network of different kind of practices. This different kind of practices, this network of different practices, could of course be described as discourse, if we understand discourse to be a term that refers to all those practices that construct and assign meaning. If this is discourse, then of course there are all sorts of other meaning-producing practices that are not necessarily speech. Waving a flag is clearly a practice that brings with it a lot of meaning. There are symbolization of the nation or my football club, for that matter, or perhaps more in line with Tübingen, your basketball club. So identities are constructed in the moment of waving a flag, or at least they are reproduced in that moment. But waving the flag is a particular meaningful, meaning-producing practice. And so in that sense, discourse, and this is a long debate in the whole world of discourse studies, discourse is not necessarily only a matter of a narrowly confined idea of text. It is actually a collection of a wider array of practices. This raises, as we discussed last week in relation to visuals, the question of how these meaning-producing practices in turn can be understood as such, and whether that presupposes a kind of textual cognitive understanding of the world. But if we leave that aside for the moment, at least we should note that meaning is not only produced through text. There are other practices that produce meaning and therefore also produce the meaning of security. And so from the point of view of security as practice, discourse is not confined to a collection of speech acts, but is conceptualized in a much broader, wider sense. Thirdly, the Copenhagen School, at least to some extent, presupposes a notion of the public as a quality of the discourse. So discourses need to be public. A speech act needs to be public. It needs to have an audience. Because if there is no audience, it cannot be effective. It cannot unfold its illocutionary and not its perlocutionary force. And so therefore, a speech act must be located in a certain public sphere. Now that is not necessarily a Habermasian public sphere in which we engage in rational discourse and deliberation. The public sphere may be very constrained, but it's got to have some sort of public element to it. There's got to be a speech that is open to a particular audience. And so speech act theory and security as speech act presupposes that there is a certain element of publicity. This is not necessarily the case, not in the same way, if we look at practices. Of course, a border guard performs practices in public to some extent, but the action of stamping a passport or whatever does not really have a particular audience. In fact, the border guard might take you away and interrogate you within an interview room hidden within four walls. Now, that's not a public engagement, yet it may be a practice of securitization. And so there is a question mark in the idea of security as practice. To what extent these things have to be public? Certainly, of course, at some moment, there's got to be also the idea of a public that accepts there is a certain securitization going on, but the individual practices may actually be hidden. They may be confined to very intricate moments of you and me somewhere. So they're not the same as the speech act in Parliament, where right from the start there is, of course, the immediate context of the parliamentarians, but beyond that, journalists that are supposed to take this out and inform the broader societal debate. Like I discussed earlier about the idea of discourse that is underneath the idea of securities practice, there's again this insistence on all meaning producing practices. I already covered this. And so we get, like in the notion of the discourse rather than the individual speech act, we move from the speech act to this web of meaning producing practices, societal practices. And this is why Thierry Balzac called this the sociological approach. In his work, Balzac distinguishes between the philosophical approach and the sociological approach. I don't think his idea of the Copenhagen School, his label for that, is particularly appropriate. It's not a philosophical approach, I don't think. Um, but clearly, the label now for securities practice is probably quite good. It's a sociological approach. It looks at practices in society. Now, people have labeled this the Paris School, and people have labeled this the Paris School because a lot of the authors initially were congregating around Paris and were citing perhaps even more French philosophers than the Copenhagen School. And a particular important figure that we're gonna meet in a moment is Didier Bigot in this exercise. Now, it should be said that then subsequently you can read all of this in lots of journal articles and textbooks and so on, and there's this opposition made up between the Paris School and the Copenhagen School, as if they lived in nearly different universes. And I think it's important to note that this was not the intention of Didier Bigot or most of the others of the initial writers in that particular vein. They were more thinking about the limitations of Copenhagen and what one could do to open up these limitations. And so Didier Bigot is very clear on the argument that he'd never intended this to be an opposition to Copenhagen, but rather a kind of amendment, perhaps, but that would be perhaps too weak. But another way of looking at things without saying that what the Copenhagen School did was crap or something. But there was something missing, and you could only get to what was missing if you adopted a different ontological approach. And so, in a very good article, he and McCluskey sort of discussed this idea of the Paris School and rejected the idea of Paris as a sort of denomination of a place that gives the name to a completely opposite view of securitization, and replaced it with an acronym where Paris stands for Political Anthropological Research and International Sociology. As is a little bit labored, of course, finding a way to appropriate this term Paris, but it nonetheless describes very nicely what this is about. It is not about analyzing speech. It is not about looking at individual speech act. It looks at societal processes, which, of course, methodologically speaking, you have to, in order to understand them, you have to actually live with them. You have to adopt anthropological methods, perhaps, to understand these practices in societies that create security. And so the broader field in which this therefore would be situated is international sociology. So Balzac was right, calling this a sociological approach. And it is the way of using methods of political anthropology and ideas of political anthropology to study the sociological processes through which social security is being constructed. And so in that sense, and I will get back to this, and I hope you will see this throughout the lecture, I see this whole idea of securities practice as an alternative way of looking at things, but in the spirit of dialogue and possible collaboration rather than opposition and confrontation, which is the way it was sometimes in the literature made out to be. In this article that I've just mentioned about the Paris approach, Bigot and McCluskey therefore identify three different characteristics of the Paris approach. One is interdisciplinarity. So if you want to look at those practices, and of course then you'll quickly note that security has a lot to do with technology, and then you have to study this from different angles. You have to try to understand sometimes even the engineering or whatever behind it. And at the same time, you've got to look at anthropology to understand the way in which in groups things work, and how do these weapons experts, for instance, work, and how do they develop their weapons and sell. I mean, there are people who go to arms trade fairs and look at how do these things actually work. This is not something that the Security as Speech Act scholar does. I mean, you've got to read texts, no? If you are a Speech Act scholar, you're not going to go to an arms fair and look at the way that they bargain over particular features of arms. It's not what you're interested in. Whereas from a Paris approach, this may be relevant because it's those moments where security is also produced. And so therefore one first characteristic is that security has to be studied from different disciplines and is then defined differently, and you need to bring these things together and get inspired by them. A second characteristic, as I already mentioned, and that is in the title, is anthropology, the focus on lived experiences, both by common people but also by professionals in their respective contexts, rather than political elite decision-making processes. And thirdly, historicity, the analysis of the historical and societal practices that define security and security objects and the power struggles implied. Now, I would say that the Copenhagen School also looks at power struggles, and indeed I would go as far as saying that if you look at Security as Speech Act, you would also have to do this historically and look at the ways in which security evolves over time. But Bigot and others, I think, would claim that the definition, the formal definition of security in the Copenhagen School is in a sense already too restrictive, and that you would have to be a bit more flexible to see how in different time periods security is coming about and how it is defined. Now they're doing a new journal which is called Paris, now with two S's in the end, and you might want to check that website out. The first issue hasn't yet appeared of the journal. I suppose Corona has delayed the process somewhat, but in the future this will be, or the idea is this will be the home ground, if you will, of a lot of these studies. Now, one of the slight differences between the Copenhagen School and the Paris School, between speech, act, and practice, is the difference between what I would call fear and risk. In the Copenhagen School, this idea of the existential threat as we've seen, has moved the idea of threat back to the extraordinary. But of course, it therefore is also a very concrete threat. It can be named. It is another state. It is something that existentially and immediately threatens my existence. And if it's not my physical existence, then it is perhaps my identity, or my economic existence, or my health existence. but there is something that can be clearly identified. There's a concrete threat that is there. Not all threats, though, operate like that, we could say. A lot of them are more diffuse. And sometimes diffuse threats can turn into concrete ones. Like, for instance, now with the coronavirus. We all live under conditions of diffuse threats of possible epidemics. We all live under the threat of constant bacteria and so on, most of which are the threat is very low and diffuse perhaps, but it is there and it's in a sense an existential threat. Climate change to some extent is more diffuse, more long term than the threat of corona as we discussed last week. So there is a different understanding of threat, which is about creating a more fundamental, if you will, insecurity in our daily lives, rather than this immediate, urgent threat that is at the same time, however, extraordinary. Many of the researchers working in the tradition of security as practice don't talk so much, therefore, about existential threats, but they talk a lot about risks. And they very often refer to Ulrich Beck's, the late Ulrich Beck's idea of risk society. Beck's idea was that modernization automatically leads to progress, but also to threats that we inflict on ourselves that are inevitable in the modernization process, but also incalculable. So we produce particular risks that can turn, of course, into existential threats. If changes in the climate lead to risks which then turn into immediate threats if the tsunami is coming towards us. But until the tsunami comes towards us, the risk is more diffuse. It is not exactly calculable. Perhaps in this particular example, incalculable would be the wrong word, but it is not as immediate as the existential threat of corona now was or is, or the existential threat of the neighbor who has aggressive policies to invade your territory. And these incalculable risks, though, lead to a reorganization of society. Once we think about them and we understand that there are these risks, then we reorganize society. Now think about resilience, and we're going to hear about resilience in the lecture after this from Marco. Think about resilience. Resilience is exactly one of those features, those new terms, new concepts that speak to the idea of incalculable risks. In fact, there's a lot of literature about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Known unknowns are where we know that there is a risk. It's just we don't know exactly how this is going to pan out. It's incalculable. But then there are, in fact, perhaps like with COVID-19, there are threats that we do not know about at all. We don't know even whether they exist. So we don't know whether we know them or not. These are those unknowns. And so the idea of risk is a lot attached to this idea that there may be unknowns, mostly known unknowns, and then there's a certain risk that I can gauge whether that will in the end be a problem or not. But there may also be a lot of unknowns out there. Now, as I already said, climate change is often therefore represented as a risk, not as an immediate existential threat. And we already discussed the difference between that and the immediate threat of COVID-19. So securitization may therefore not be about existential threats necessarily, but rather about those risks that then lead to diffuse fears about the unknowable. And this has led to some debate about whether this is actually still to be called security or securitization. Olaf Corey, for instance, thinks that this is a different thing, so we should distinguish between riskification and securitization. Together with other colleagues, I have made the claim that these are two different forms of securitization. And I think in the end of the day, what I think is important here is that even with an understanding of risk, we ultimately do that to sort of intimate that there is an existential threat lurking behind this, and that then therefore legitimizes particular measures. Let's not call them extraordinary, because one of the features of those measures is that because the risk will not go away so easily, and it's going to be continued and routinized. But there are these measures that without the existence of the risk, or at least the discursive existence of the risk, we would not see as legitimate those measures. So in a project about climate change that I did together with Franz von Lucke and Sarah Wellmann, we tried to capture this relationship between risk and threat, existential threat, in this figure. And we added to this, in a sense, things that we talked about last week, and that is that security and politics may not be two separate realms, that you can either be politics or insecurity, but rather a continuum. And so what you see here is a triangle where there is politics, where there is risk, and we call the other side then the one that is the classic threat. We call that danger, because the argument is that there is that in a sense that threats can be both, take the form of danger and risk. So we have politics, danger, and risk, and therefore we have different kinds of securitizations. We called one threatification and the other one riskification. And both of these are continuum. So both of these, we cannot say that there is a world of politics without securitization. Politics, as we've seen last week, because securitization, for instance, is necessary to bring something onto the agenda. Securitization is at the heart of any founding story of any state. States are normally founded in order to stabilize a particular order against a threat, either against the former colonizer or against civil war. So each state has a certain idea of a foundational myth that is nothing but a securitization. And so every politics has some degree of securitization inbuilt. The question is, of course, how prominent that securitization is and to what extent it has receded into the background. But let's not pretend that there is a politics without securitization. What is then problematic, perhaps? Of course, every degree of securitization may be problematic, but what is more problematic is the moment in the Copenhagen school logic, in a way, the moment where the securitization or the features of securitization, the marginalizing, the exclusionary aspects of securitization become so strong that it is no longer defensible. And this is what we try to capture here with that threshold. So in a sense, you could there, and of course, we had to put a line somewhere. De facto, it is not a line. There is a zone where beyond which we could say that securitization can no longer be legitimized. But there's also a zone where every kind of politics requires some previous securitization. And that securitization, as I just said, can take two forms, and that gets you to that triangle, where then in turn also, as I just said earlier about, how climate change may lead to a tsunami, etc. And this would be on the level between, on the side between risk and danger. So this is what we call threat risk oscillation. This is just an attempt from a concrete research project, is an attempt to capture this complexity of different kinds of securitization and different understandings of threat. And it's an attempt in the spirit of dialogue and trying to bring things together. Now, we've talked a lot about this idea of risk and this sense of insecurity in daily lives. And Didier Bigot, one of the co-figures, as I said, of the Paris School, captured this once very nicely, I think, in the term of the governmentality of unease. I really like this term because, on the one hand, it relates to this reference to the daily life and not the extraordinary threat, but a sense of unease. On the other hand, by using the term governmentality, it also invokes associations with the work of Foucault and the way in which there are governmental practices that order our lives. And we will see that securitization in the way of practices is a lot about these governmental practices. So we see, therefore, we've seen how there is in modern societies, if we follow back, an increasing feeling of unease, of insecurity. This is permanent. It's not an extraordinary situation. And now, in a sense, we can read this together with the idea of Foucault, who proposed that there are different ways of governing. And some of you may remember this from last semester's lecture on international institutions. There's the idea that there is a kind of sovereign governing, what the king used to do, decree from top down what is to be done. There is the idea of a kind of welfare state governance, a governmentality that is more trying to govern people at a distance. But there's also the notion of a broader kind of governmentality in which there is a lot more governance, self-governance in networks, if you will. There is no longer the idea of norms that are set, but governing means to understand or get a sense of how societies work, how they tick, how their statistical distribution is, and to therefore just try and make normal life possible when normal is what most people kind of do. And we will see how this is very much related to some of the work from this direction. So rather than governing top down, there's this idea of a decentralized form of self-government in which things like best practices, certain technologies and statistics play an important role. So this is about the techniques and procedures designed to govern the conduct of both individuals and populations at every level, not just in administrative or political terms. So in other words, this diffuse feeling of unease is met by a diffuse form of government in the form of this specific kind of governmentality. It is not about the decreeing of orders. It's about trying to govern the way we govern ourselves, of the government of entire populations through trying to capture their sizes, their movements, etc., in what is often referred to as biopolitics. This works through not normation, where I deduce from philosophical thinking or whatever, particular norms that I want to impose on a society. Rather, the practice here is normalization. I look for what is normal, what is the average, and that is what is then set as, what is to be achieved. I look for the, the 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 biggest baby, so to speak, and if the baby is too big, if it's in the last 5%, then it's probably a problem, independent of whether it is a problem or not, because it may not be. So we're looking for anomalies. And this looking for anomalies becomes a security practice because the anomaly is then often seen as the threat. The anomaly is associated with risk, with a long-term possible threat, as Aradau and Blank in a recent piece about algorithms have pointed out. This is a very different kind of securitization, but the argument is it is not less effective than the classic securitization of the Speech Act. And in that process of securitization as practices, through these governmental techniques, the statistics, the figuring out of anomalies, the algorithms, and so on, a different kind of practitioner becomes much more important than compared to the Copenhagen School's idea of Security Speech Act, where the politician, perhaps the journalist, is at the forefront. Here now, the site of securitization is not traditional politics. The site of securitization is much more the expert, the technocrat. These are the core securitizing actors. They are themselves, of course, not actors in the traditional sense because they are part of this broader machine, if you will, the broader historical discursive context, the practical context in which they are set. They're not subjects, sovereigns in the traditional sense of the term. Nonetheless, the site of this contestation, the site of the securitization is not the parliament. It is, as I said earlier, the arms trade fair, or the laboratory, or the computer lab, where the big computers stand that do the calculations for the algorithms. So this is also a lot technology driven. Technology allows securitization, but also provides legitimacy to securitization. So existing technology may drive securitization because it makes certain things possible. It changes the existence of particular techniques, the possibility to create an app with which I can trace people changes the way we conceptualize security. Security becomes something else through this technology. And it may or may not be that security thinking is at the beginning of the development of the technology. Bureaucratic routines become very important. I already made the example earlier of the passport control. Borders are sites of securitization. It's a very important field. And so a lot of these scholars who work in this tradition, a lot of those who see security as practice, they draw on, among others, on Bourdieu. In fact, the whole idea of practices is a Bourdieuan term. So they talk about particular fields in which professionals have a particular societal cultural power that they can work with and employ. So it's not just the idea of capital in terms of money. I mean, you will all have come across the terms of social capital and cultural capital. I mean, these are Bourdieuan terms where there is a particular context where particular knowledges are important forms of capital, where you can have more influence and more power through knowledge than through money, for instance. And so we can if we zoom in then on this idea of practice, we can define practices. And, these are terms that are taken by scholars that refer to Bourdieu in one way or another. Practices as routinized types of behavior which constitute meaning. That condenses what we already talked about. But at the same time, practices are, of course, also collations of individual acts that are rooted in contingent moments. Contingent moments where social behavior of the everyday makes certain practices possible, but also needs to be reproduced through those practices. And if you've studied in Tuebingen, perhaps you will know the Adler, Nissen and Pouillot text, where it's about diplomatic negotiations and the question of how those practices also, of course, involve a moment of creativity and therefore change. Practices do not stand on their own. They are embedded in broader historical and cultural contexts. And they are also conditioned by, and in turn condition, material factors. So this is, where the technology comes in. The technology is a material fact, if you will, but it embodies, of course, particular ideas and practices, and it in turn performs practices. So actors who perform practices are part of a broader network in which the material elements also act. In the work of Bruno Latour and his actor network theory, the material is an actant that is a potential actor, and it is not something that is just there, but in the network with humans, but also animals, plants, and others, it can also act. The machine also acts. It is not independent of human actors, but we have to understand this as a broader network. As we will soon see, the body scanner at the border acts, it does something to security in the same way as the speech act of the securitizing move does something to security. And security is thus produced through what one might call the continuous interplay of these practices in a broad network of elements. And from a Foucauldian point of view, we may talk about those collection of different elements, and assemblage. Different parts come together to produce an understanding of security. And this is why, in a sense, from Bigot's perspective, this is not it is not to say that the Coven School was wrong. They just didn't see the entire thing. They didn't see the whole network. They didn't see the assemblage. They only saw a little bit of it. And therefore, they missed part of the securitization process. So comparing Securities Speech Act and securities practice, we see that what comes back into the picture here is the human being, but also the societies at large and how they are governed. Again, it is all sectors, although we will see there's a heavy emphasis on the societal sector that is the focus. There is the daily threat, not the extraordinary threat representation. It's a critical problematizing theory because it wants to alert us to those securitizing practices, discourses that happen perhaps in our everyday lives. And it is a contextual, we saw the importance of history in the definition of Bigot. It's a contextual approach, understanding, and it's a critical constitutive approach and understanding. And in that sense, it's quite similar, of course, to Securities Speech Act. I would now like to give you a few examples before we come to the critique of concrete studies. If we look at what people from this idea of securities practices have particularly looked at, they've looked at things like data protection after 9/11 and how that has become securitized, and how in that securitization process there's not only been parliaments that have been there, border control strategies and technologies, the surveillance policies in relation to migration. And so sometimes, these are fields that have also been covered by the Copenhagen School in the idea of Securities Speech Act. Migration clearly has. But now the focus is not on the way in which the immigrant is portrayed in the newspaper. The focus is on the technologies and the moment where the immigrant crosses the border and the border technologies that are there, or perhaps how they are no longer confined only to the moment where there is this imaginary line that the migrant crosses. So Bigot, another piece by Bigot in 2002, deals with the question of security and immigration. He says we need to look at this from what he calls a security prism. He refers to this general feeling on unease. Part of the policy response is then a convergence of internal and international security. The migrant questions that distinction between what is internal and international security. And he argues that a lot of this is brought forward by security professionals, those who deal with border control technology, those who deal with migration control, and this includes also academics. These folks are not, they don't necessarily want to securitize. That's not their intention. That's also something that is perhaps different from the Speech Act, where in most cases the Speech Act is intended. But here they are mostly driven by their own interests. They want to sell their new technology to print passports. They want to sell their new technology to control borders. They want to be cited by other scholars and get into the best journals or what have you. So they're all driven by their own interests, and they want to sort of transform technologies, but also they are pushed by the transformation of technologies. Yet, by performing these practices, they nonetheless produce security, even though they're not perhaps intending this. And they do so as parts of nodes in a broader network, is Bigot's argument. The state is seen as a symbolic political order in which both territory plays a role, but also the bureaucracy. And what for the state is important is that the state wants to control immigration. It wants to master its territory, as a will to mastery, as he calls it. Now, he does now go into the ways in which the traditional securitization approach would represent the migrant now as a threat to the national self. And there is already the issue that this may not be the case, but it's actually a question of not the existential threat that the migrant poses, but there are daily practices of border control, etc., that are in a completely different kind of landscape, if you will, but nonetheless also represent the migrant as security. Anyway, because this traditional securitization in representing the migrant as a threat to the national self, as seeing like a politician would see migration. But he calls this, he sets this against the technological securitization. And again, it's about the interaction of the both. And this technological securitization is about the profiling of migrants. What happens in the bureaucracies, in the various kind of expert groups that develop schemes of distinguishing the good from the bad migrant. What happens in the offices of those who develop surveillance technologies. These are security professionals, and they are often bound up in transnational fields. They go to the same conferences, they go to the same trade fairs, etc., and they talk to each other, and they form this field in which security practices are set. And it's these kind of things, the production, securitization of the migrant, that the Copenhagen School, or seeing security as a speech act, would not be able to capture. And therefore, Bigot sets against the seeing like a politician. He's contrasting this with the seeing like a professional manager of unease. That's a very cumbersome title, but he means seeing like the professional rather than the politician. And then, if you look at this from this perspective, what security is, it is something different. It's not the existential threat to national identity. It's about managing populations. It's about moving people around and sorting out who's supposed to get in or not. And this can become a very technocratic exercise where the whole normative dimension is at some point completely excluded or marginalized. In this context, he has this nice little phrase of a movement from panopticon to a banopticon. In Foucault's Discipline and Punish, there's a story about, or the core is a story about how in the prison there's a fictional point from which you can see all the prisoners, and because the prisoners assume that there's someone who can see them all, then of course they start to behave and conduct themselves in ways in which they got to be careful and obey the rules, and in a way what Bigot says, that the in relation to migration, security does no longer work as a panopticon only, in which the migrant comes in and then there's surveillance and the moves of the migrants are being checked constantly, but actually a panopticon in a sense that the migrant cannot even get in, and is kept outside spheres of politics, even if they are in the territory. Bigot and Elspeth Guild, his wife, were involved in a number of projects funded, interestingly, also by the EU, and one of them was about the proliferation of EU borders and how there were limits of freedom. And I'm going to show you just a few minutes of this video, and then you can see the address here, and then you can look at it yourself. But the very interesting thing is that a classic securitization Copenhagen school type, security as speech act type would not look at these kind of things, how borders proliferate and create migration or inhibit migration. But for Bigot and Gall, this was a lot of their work was about this. So let's just have a glimpse into this. You can also see Bigot himself.
La question des frontières européennes est une question qui oblige à changer l'univers mental dans lequel nous raisonnons. Lorsque nous raisonnons sur les frontières européennes, nous pensons immédiatement aux frontières des États membres de l'Union européenne.
The traditional tale of the border of the European Union is that it is like a girdle that encircles the 27 member states, leaving aside, of course, the United Kingdom and Ireland, which have their own separate arrangements. But that it is like a pencil line that you can draw on a map to see what is Europe and where is Europe. These three maps give a vision of what border controls mean in Europe, which is quite different from the narrative which one normally hears from the European Commission or indeed from the member states.
Les frontières ne sont pas aussi liées aux frontières des États qu'on voudrait le signifier. Qu'est-ce que cela signifie? Cela signifie que les contrôles, la plupart du temps, sont délocalisés par rapport à l'endroit des frontières. Ils suivent bien plus les mouvements des personnes.
These three maps show quite a different idea of what is Europe, quite a different construction of the meaning of Europe, where it is to be found, and how Europe interacts with the rest of the world as people, as human beings, as foreigners, and as migrants.
Another piece that is often cited in the context of security as practice is by Claudia Agradau and Rens van Münster. This is called Governing Terrorism Through Risk, and these two see war on terror as a new form of governmentality. This approach links now the urgency of Copenhagen with the idea of the daily routines of Paris. And they put forward two core concepts. One is risk, and again they take this from Ulrich Beck, but where risk in Ulrich Beck comes back to society and leads to reordering of society. They view risk now as something that governments use to order societies. So governments use risk to order societies. Risk becomes an ordering device. And what is for them important is the way in which the war on terror has led to practices in which risk is invoked to impose particular political orders onto societies. And what the kind of order they've got particular in mind is the idea that insurance, which you normally took out in order to guard yourself against risk, where insurance was a principle initially to spread risk across many. You pay into an insurance so that if something happens, you don't have to bear the whole cost, but the cost is shared by all those who pay into the insurance. Instead, now risk is countered no longer by such principles of insurance, but by the principle of precaution, which ultimately means avoiding risk at all cost. And this may perhaps in the world of climate change work now in different ways than it works in relation to terror. Because if you want to avoid risk at all cost, and if terrorism is represented as such a risk, then ultimately this means to come to policies in which societies have to be reshaped and reordered in a governmental sense through daily practices of governing ourselves in order to minimize the risk that terrorism poses. And you will have all have heard these stories of, say, people on the plane who see that their neighbor is reading something in Arabic, and then he starts perhaps to behave as if he was praying or something, and they call the flight attendant, and the whole flight is delayed because this thing is reported, and this may be a potential terrorist, and so on. And so these processes of the precautionary principle in relation to terrorism has consequences for the way that we govern ourselves, partly because there are campaigns to be particularly vigilant in public transport. So this is one way in which this works. The second core concept that they then introduce is the idea of the dispositif. We've already encountered the term of the assemblage, a Foucauldian term that relates to all those elements in which security is produced. And they cite Foucault here in terms of the assemblage of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions. So there are different techniques that assemble together to produce security. And this leads to particular rationalities and particular technologies, particular things that ought to be achieved, and the ways in which one would achieve this. In the war on terror, Aradau and Münster now argue, the rationalities are, according to the principles of precaution, zero risk, worst case scenarios, and shifting the burden of proof, and serious and irreversible damage as the one that is to be avoided. And how does one avoid this? How does one achieve or implement those rationalities? One does this through preemptive strikes, camps like Guantanamo Bay, extraordinary rendition, indefinite retention, all-encompassing surveillance. And all of these are technologies that are legitimized, if you will, by a conception of zero risk, the worst case scenario, etc. Now, a former PhD student of mine, Matthias Lees, who is now in Geneva, did a study on body scanners. And I quite like this study because for me it is a very good example of security as practices. And again, this is a slide that is taken from his original presentation that he once did in this class. He argues that whereas in Copenhagen there was a Speech Act at the center, here technology is one of the focal points. How does technology come into being? It comes into being through long-term research and development processes, which there are very high financial stakes. And there is this invisible network of security professionals, policymakers, funded research, partly funded, partly by third parties, and the industry that come together to produce this technology. But all of this is not just something that happens in parliaments, not at the moment of the decision now to acquire this body scanner, but there are these networks behind it. And so from from a Copenhagen school perspective, Matthias argued at the time, one would have now focused on the discursive framing that allowed body scanners to be put into airports. And a lot of this had to do with a particular incident in Christmas 2009 when a guy in an American airport wore some explosives in his underpants and was therefore called the underpant bomber. And therefore, that led to the idea that one needed to enhance security screening in this war on terror at the moment of entering the airport, or at least entering the security zone. This, of course, has a lot to do with the notions of exceptionalism, bypassing of civil liberties, etc., which come as an effect of securitization. But now Matthias's question was, this is not wrong, but then how does this fit with this long-term process of developing the technology that was obviously already there, in parts at least, before the underpant bomber, and designing a new security technology? And he argues that here the perspective of security as practice, or the Paris perspective, is much more helpful. It depicts the political discourse only a small part of the broader security dispositif, and looks at other parts of this dispositif, the notion of technocracy and business opportunities, through the creation and upholding of threat analyses, the expertise of the security professionals as the drivers behind new technologies, and the notion of an emerging security market. This is where the money and the business comes in, with untapped business potential. You want to be able to sell those body scanners, and they're very expensive to purchase. And the technology ultimately may even pay off. Now, finally, I also thought we'll think a little bit about what this means for analyzing COVID-19. And I would say, that in contrast to last week, we have three perhaps potential entry points for such an analysis. One is to look more into the importance of professionals in the process, the role of science, but also the way in which science is perceived to have a role, which seems to me to be quite important. Now, to some extent, of course, we can say that as long as this is about the scientist who is now invited to talk shows and gives public statements, then this is still in line with security as a speech act. But we can also think of those who participate in developing techniques to test people for their immunity, for instance, and how these are part of securitization processes. Secondly, we might want to think about surveillance technology and biopower, the question of the development of data apps and the role that data apps play, and the ambiguity of those in, on the one hand, helping to track the virus, but yet at the same time, the degree to which they infringe on personal privacy. Debates around this idea that you have a kind of ID card or pass that allows you, to demonstrate that you are immune, for instance, or the tracing of telephone data in many countries as a response to COVID-19. And there's a very interesting article that you may want to have a look at that was just recently published already in response to COVID-19, employing such an approach. But then also, thirdly, we may think about the securitization that takes place through the daily practices of wearing masks or entry restrictions, the queues that are now forming in front of your favorite bakery in the morning when you get up and want to get your bread rolls, or the pathways that are marked out in shops where it's a one-way stream. In fact, what is the security implication of the fact that if you want to enter the Institute of Political Science, you cannot just enter now. You have to ring the bell. There are marks where you can go and where you can't go. If we want to do an exam there, we have to think about a one-way system, etc. So all of these may be things that also contribute to the securitization of COVID-19, but they are not securitizing moves in the way that we encountered them last week, they are more in line with security as practice. Yet this also raises now an issue. To what extent are they perhaps necessary? Or are there some hidden force? And so this, of course, gets us to the whole issue around the demonstrations that we see now coming up against what people see as unnecessary restrictions of their private life, but also of democracy. And of course, some of them do not necessarily have very democratic views, in fact. So they would be quite happy to be restricted in other contexts. So we get into a difficult position now, and to some extent, of course, this also applies to speech act ideas of security. Ultimately, on the one hand, of course, it is very good that we question securitizing processes. It is very good that we keep the debate open. And in fact, Steinmeier, our president, just today had an interview somewhere where he said that he very much thinks it's a good thing that the debate has never been entirely closed. I think that there's, of course, degrees of closure, but of course, this is a value in and of itself. But at the same time, there may also be boundaries to critique. So there may be boundaries to the opening of discursive space. If this, in the end, leads to some sort of conspiracy theory, then of course I think we would have probably not really followed the path of critique, but led to a new kind of very powerful structure. So while power is of course in discourse inescapable, at the same time we see that questioning those power structures may also at some point lead to the opening up of the discourse to particular articulations that in themselves are very problematic. And this is certainly an issue that we have to confront. People like Bigot, but also Rob Walker or Andrew Neil have pointed to the fact that we maybe therefore not so much want to think about a balance of security and liberty, where security cuts down liberty and liberty is the opposite of security, but rather see those as co-constituted, and that each society defines security and liberty in a sense together. Through the definition of liberty, we also define security, and vice versa. Now, this already leads us to the problems of seeing security as practice and of that discourse. Clearly, the advantage is that it alerts us to underlying processes of securitization that the Copenhagen School, the idea of security as a speech act, does not capture. However, it does raise a number of issues. One of the advantages of seeing security as a speech act was the allocation of responsibility. Those who speak bear responsibility for speaking security and the consequences, both positive and negative. But if it's all a broad network in which the material also acts, etc., questions of responsibility are much more difficult to answer. Responsibility is much more difficult to be allocated. Secondly, the question is whether, even if there is research and development long-term behind particular technologies, even if practitioners and business people in trade fairs are interested in other things than discussing security or taking security decisions, is there not also at some point a point of decision? Someone does in the end have to purchase the body scanner. Someone does have to decide whether to use the app or not. So yes, of course, the broader context is not captured, therefore, by the Speech Act. But one might want to argue that, at least in a narrow sense, one can perhaps identify those moments of decision that are not independent from what happened before, but which somehow are then the moment when whatever happened before is translated into a particular political decision, and therefore that this is the main securitizing point. Thirdly, what actually I find most interesting in all of this debate is if we take the security as practice solution, that particular discourse, how do we know when something is securitized? Now, the whole idea of the Copenhagen School was that we don't know when something is, or what security actually is, and therefore we've got to look at the ways in which something is represented, and that gives us an answer to what security is. If you come from a Paris School perspective or look at security as a practice, then in order to identify security practices, you will have to know where to look. And in that sense, you've got to have a particular understanding of security before you look. So I have to say that I'm rather skeptical of the idea that through such a lens you can come to different understandings of security in different historical circumstances. At the end of the day, you will have to identify what is a security practice, and therefore you will probably take your own understanding of security and impose it. And of course, there might be different practices leading to something that is security, quote unquote, in other cultures and so on. But this is probably not called security, and whatever it is called, it may be something that is not the same, or at least not to be put in equation to the idea of security. So in that sense, there is a certain fundamental tension between security as a speech act and security as a practice, which has to do with the perhaps epistemological point of how do we know security. And here I think the Paris School is not entirely clear on how do we select those practices that count as security practices. And fourthly, remember the piece by Aradau and Van Münster. I think that at the end of the day, what they call risk, very often, if you look at those speech acts, it takes the form of a classic securitizing move. So if, for instance, politicians talk about risk avoidance at all cost, is that not ultimately a kind of securitizing move? Is risk avoidance at all cost in the light of the war on terror? It's not terror is the extraordinary threat and existential threat, and then risk avoidance at all cost leads to extraordinary measures, and then extraordinary rendition and the Guantanamo Bay and so on are all practices that would normally not be seen as legitimate, but they are legitimized through invoking an existential threat. So if we look at these kind of things, and this is perhaps an extreme example, but you can look into other examples of such writings, I would say that at the end of the day, there is very often not that much difference, especially when it comes then to identifying the securitization acts and referring in that through particular statements. Then it becomes very close to the Copenhagen School. So in sum, I would say that this idea of security as practice is a helpful corrective to the Copenhagen School. And clearly, we need to see that the Speech Act is not isolated. And I did make that point already last time. And now we can add that the context in which this is happening is not only a context of text in the narrow sense, discourse in the narrow sense, but rather a broad array of practices that lead to the Speech Act, and in turn that in the implementation that Speech Act is reproduced through particular practices. But I would also still maintain that this should not lead to a disregard of the moment of decision or traditional politics, because very often that is still very central in turning something into security and legitimizing all these practices. My view would be that therefore we should see the Paris School as this amendment, but also perhaps we need to still work on solving the epistemological puzzle behind it, namely when do we then recognize security when we see it. So we saw today that for the Paris School and security as practice, the meaning of security also varies, but security is not only spoken, it is ultimately enacted in security practices. These practices include the daily work of professionals and bureaucrats, but they also include the workings of machinery. Security is not the exception, but it is a means of governing our daily lives. As in security as a speech act, security is problematic, however. It marginalizes, it excludes, it limits freedom. One may see speech acts now as one kind of practice. So the two discourses, as I've tried to argue, are linked and are not opposed to each other necessarily. At the same time, we've seen that there are tensions when it comes in particular to a core assumption of security as a speech act. How do we know a security act when we see one? This is a question that you might want to think about further. With that, I'll end today's lecture. I thank you for your patience. And next week, we're going to get a video by Marco Krüger, I hope, on security as resilience. Bye-bye.